Greetings, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lara Smith. Happy to welcome you here to this event. Happy to get it started. My name is Lara Smith. I'm the director of the African Studies program and an associate professor at Georgetown University. Happy to welcome you today's event. Today's event is called Keep Eyes on Sudan: Mass Displacement, Food Insecurity, and Sudanese Women. It's hosted by a number of partners, including Georgetown's African Studies program, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Georgetown Conflict Resolution Program, and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. This event is just the first in a series of events that we're holding throughout this academic year. Please keep close attention to both our African Studies and Center for Contemporary Arab Studies websites, the other program websites, as well as your email to stay up to date to find out what the next events will be. As the title suggests, this event is focusing on issues of mass displacement, food insecurity, and Sudanese women as relates to the ongoing conflict in Sudan. Our panelists today will highlight the urgency of these needs, but also the creativity, the capacity, the agency of Sudanese humanitarians, women, and men. Women in particular will be highlighted as important actors in current and prospective peace talks. Today, we're featuring three prominent speakers, and I'd like to introduce them to you as we get started. For the sake of time, I'm going to abbreviate their bios, but you'll find their full biographies on our website, and my colleagues will be sending more information through the chat to you as well. Reem Abbas is a feminist activist, researcher, and writer. Last year, she published a book titled Undoing Resistance, Authoritarianism, and Attacks on the Arts in Sudan's 30 Years of Islamist Rule. She also conducted research on the women's movement in Sudan and issues related to peace and security. She's a former non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute on Middle East Policy, and she's now a communications coordinator at WILPF, where she co-hosts the Mobilizing Men for Feminist Peace podcast and works on many cross-cutting program components. Second is Hala Al Karib, who's the regional director for the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa. Versed in human rights, women's studies, and psychology, Hala's work specifically focuses on women and girls' rights activism, social movements, as well as refugees, displaced persons, and minority communities' challenges. She's the editorial chief of SIHA's journal, Women in Islam in the Horn of Africa. In addition to SIHA, Hala has worked with numerous international organizations in Sudan, East Africa, and the Horn of Africa. And thirdly, we have Abubakr Omer, who leads transformative initiatives to cultivate self-reliant communities in conflict and climate impacted regions. His focus is on designing solidarity-based models within agri-food systems to drive comprehensive economic development. With extensive experience across public and private sectors, civil society, and academia, he forges strategic partnerships and trans-border collaborations to meet localized needs and drive systemic change. I'm delighted that these three amazing panelists will be in conversation by our moderator, African Studies Program adjunct professor, Abdullahi Halakhe, who's also a senior advocate for East and Southern Africa at Refugees International. Throughout this event, our staff from Georgetown will be posting some of the recent publications from our various speakers. We'll also be posting a document that highlights different organizations that you can support or donate to that are working in the region if you feel so inclined, and we encourage you to do so if you're able. Following several rounds of questions with our speakers, we'll open it up to questions and answers with you, the audience. If you have a question, feel free to submit using the Q&A function in Zoom that can be found in the bottom of your screen. You can also email my colleague Coco Tate at ct885@georgetown.edu, which you can also find in the chat. And so I very gratefully turn it over to the three panelists and to my colleague, Professor Halakhe.
No, thank you so much, Lara, and thank you for the centers who are helping us host this. It is 1 month and almost 5 months since the Sudan conflict erupted. And we are running out of superlatives to describe how dire the situation is. We are crossing all the landmarks, the number of people displaced, having famine on one part of the country, and potentially having genocide in other parts of the country. Women and their bodies have been used as a site of these violations. And I wanted to start by asking, this question around famine. Over the past 20 years, famine has only been declared 3 times, and the last time it was declared was in Sudan in July of 2024, when the Famine Review Committee declared, famine in Zamzam refugee camp in the outskirts of Al-Fasher. But the Famine Review Committee also said that there is a likelihood of this continued denial of access, restriction for humanitarian and commercial actors, and declining harvest, that we will continue seeing this level of food insecurity. To the panelists, this is not the first time starvation has been used as a weapon of war in Sudan's history since independence. How did we get here, and how can we stop and prevent further deterioration? Either of you can take it, Hala, Reem, Abubakr, feel free. Let's start, Abubakr, with you.
Okay, thank you, Abdullahi. I just find the information you just shared very interesting, that in the past 20 years, famine was declared 3 times, and the 3rd time is back in July in Sudan. I would like us to just zoom out a little bit with regards to Sudan. And the research, the history tells us that in the past 150 years, specifically from 1888 till 2024, famine was declared in Sudan 8 times. Almost every generation in the past century went through a major famine. I just want us to carry this information along the discussion. Thank you.
Just to
Hala.
add to what Abubakr was saying, it's true. I think it's also a very political issue. So famine has always been a very political issue. And from the side of the government or the army, if I may say, there is a precedent, okay? So Operation Lifeline, if you've heard about it, in the 1990s, it was one of the largest humanitarian operations in the world, covering the southern Sudan at the time, and now South Sudan. So it became very political because the authorities viewed the Operation Lifeline as a lifeline to the conflict itself and as a lifeline to the rebels. So it was framed in a way that if this Operation Lifeline does not exist and it did not continue kind of giving food, then the war or the rebels could have basically submitted in a way, because some of the food, of course, it was taken, by the soldiers and so on. And this is why it's very political. Right now, there is a situation where both sides are using it, as a tool to maneuver and to also pressure and to also kind of force some kind of international, lobbying. And from what I'm seeing is that, in the side of the RSF, or the places, the locations that are controlled by the RSF, they continue to loot not only the food and the produce, but also they continue to disrupt and destruct all the different equipments, agricultural equipments, from stealing tractors to basically making it throwing away the seeds, just doing things like that to make sure that people are unable to farm. And this is a very big problem in Sudan, because although we've always had malnutrition, it was always an issue because we have conflict in Sudan. When you have conflict, you always have malnutrition. We had some kind of infrastructure that kind of ensured that a lot of the food aid is actually bought from the local market. So there are 2 examples that I want to say. a lot of the, the wheat and the maize and the different things that are used are bought from the local market, were bought from the local market, of course, because of before this conflict. And the second thing is, for example, we had a factory in Khartoum that produced RUTF, which is the ready to, to eat food that is given to to basically to kids who have malnutrition. This factory was basically completely destroyed in the first month of the war. So the infrastructure that enabled Sudan, even though it's a very fragile country, to kind of, be able to still have food and things that could be used by the organizations to support the local communities is no longer there. And I think this is a very good point that should be shared.
Yeah, so I guess I should take it from there. Just following up on what Reem has said. Basically, what's happening in Sudan is unprecedented and unheard of, I think, in Africa over the past, 4 or 5 decades. The level of destructions and the level of looting that has been happening across the country, particularly by the RSF, where you were talking about, an armed militia that's controlling over 60% of the country. So mostly, let's say, above 75% of Darfur region that's controlled by the RSF, and then Al Jazeera state, which is considered the breadbasket of Sudan. And, it's a region or a territory that was supplying food across the country. It's also a destination for farmers from Kordofan and from different parts of the country. The other issue is the looting of local markets. We don't have a functioning local market except for a very few locations. So most of the local markets has been completely looted. Most of the, as Reem said, of the factories were destroyed. Only this morning I was reading about, a massive looting and theft of livestock. So, so right now there is, I would say, hundreds and hundreds of livestock that has been stolen from Al Jazeera, and so it's an absolutely constructed, man-made, famine that has been happening from day one, because this type of, it's a conflict that has been occurring inside civilian cities, inside civilian markets. It's markets that has been subjected to shelling and then later to extensive looting. Homes have been looted, small businesses were looted. I was speaking to some of the service providers in south of Khartoum, and they would tell me that it's not even safe, in an RSF control area to move around with just 2 tomatoes and like the equivalent of 1 penny on the streets. You would subject yourself to being killed, so it's, it's something that was definitely made, and the women were at the front line in terms of struggling, and enduring the consequences of the famine. We have confirmed reports that the women in Niala, in South Darfur and in Central Darfur, they were banned from accessing, their field, and they were banned from farming. That is happening, consistently. We have reports of women that were forced to work for free and hand in, crops to RSF commanders who are going to sell it to the community as non-affordable prices. The collapse of the health facilities as well in most of the country's cities and territories is another disaster. I would honestly say, Sudan is definitely at this point is collapsing, and and famine is one of the manifestations of that collapse. But there is so many other issues, in addition to famine, including insecurity, including the collapse of the health sector, including the violence against civilians and so on. Yeah, over to
Yeah,
you.
brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. Just to stay in the same question, whereas we are seeing, humanitarian access as a problem, whereas we are seeing the destruction of objects that are indispensable to the civilian population, that is the market, the tools, the factories. Because we have to remember that it's not just Al Jazeera or just Sudan. It doesn't just provide food and transportation hub just for Sudan. It's also South Sudan and also Chad. So that effect will be felt outward. But I want all of you to probably take a minute or two to talk about the Sudanese who have remained the lifeline, the last mile of delivery of humanitarian aid, whether, people in the diaspora contributing money, sending back home to mutual aid groups that, despite the difficult situation that you've all known, you've all discovered, and you all intimately are familiar with, these groups have stayed and be able to deliver. Can you speak to that and what can be done in order to enhance their capacity to scale up and be able to deliver the humanitarian aid that is desperately needed every day? Abubakar, تفضل يا أخي.
Yeah.
Reem, go on.
Okay, yes. So I think what we really got out of the 2019 revolution is this like revolutionary infrastructure, whether it's the, resistance committees, different groups and organizations that organized at the neighborhood level at the time to mobilize the protests and so on. But then later on, they are now the lifeline for the community. So they are the ones, providing social services to many, people and communities who are left behind in the conflict areas and even in the relatively safe areas. They're the ones managing community kitchens. So they're like soup kitchens where people can come and eat for free, and they give them a meal a day, and it's usually the only meal they have every day. So those are the local responders right now. They are the ones making sure that the community is fed. They are the ones coordinating any healthcare kind of services that are happening, trying to operate the different neighborhood-based health center or clinic, coordinating with the doctors, coordinating with different organizations to come and cater to the needs of the communities. So really, I feel that this infrastructure that was built for decades, basically in Sudan, is right now functioning to save the communities and keep them alive. And they're the ones almost operating like a local government, okay? They are the ones really providing, even in some cases, they're providing educational, facilities, they are teaching, they are doing things with kids, because right now kids have not been going to school for the second year in a row. So this system is very important, and usually it's supported by Sudanese in the diaspora or Sudanese even inside Sudan who are able to contribute. Every penny really makes a difference, basically. So right now, it's definitely a very interesting situation because the war has definitely, caused has dropped basically, especially the Sudanese middle class, in Khartoum and in Jazeera and in central Sudan. That was kind of the very much the active agents, and the active change agents in the society. It has robbed them of generational wealth because now they're mostly refugees or displaced, they've lost their houses, livelihoods, and so on. And this was the force that used to really shake things up and used to kind of contribute the most. And right now they're really just trying to rebuild their lives and so on. So there are definitely huge gaps because people cannot afford, to do this. And a lot of support is needed. So I think right now building trust between, donors and humanitarian actors specifically, and the local responders and the very informal kind of networks that are doing this kind of work is very important because they need the resources and they also need critical things that they can use, such as, medicine, such as first aid kits, things like that. So building the trust and making sure that they're able to support each other and that they're able to continue supporting the communities is very important. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Abdullahi, I think from the way you presented the question that we can deal with at two levels. We have the immediate response, the emergency response, and then we have the medium to long-term response, how to move out of dependency, out of need, towards resilience and development. And with regards to the immediate response, I think Sudanese communities throughout the decades, maybe centuries, have proved that there's a local governance in Sudan through the diversity and the different groups. There are indigenous ways to, let's say, fight the bleak reality. What I think we really struggle with is how to move out of this situation towards sustainability. I remember earlier I mentioned that just in 150 years, we went through 8 famines. And just before the war, during 2020, 2021, 2022, 1 in 3 Sudanese people was hungry. This was before the war, before the destruction of factories, before the looting of markets. We have a chronic issue of food production and distribution. And I think the immediate response usually is clear. We need to provide humanitarian aid to people who are in need. But the tricky part is to understand the patterns and the systemic structure and the mental models driving this chronic cycle of famine, of displacement, and of war. If you could guide us through maybe the medium to long-term responses and how can we discuss this issue, I think it would be helpful. Thank you.
Hala, I mean, I'll direct this at you because this is your life work, working on gender.
Right.
And women in Sudan have borne the disproportionate impact of this conflict. This conflict is fought on the bodies of women. We've had, every credible human rights group, independent organizations like yourselves that have been in the front line of this. Can you take us through what it means to be a woman in Sudan now? And what are the possible futures that they have? Because if they are not being killed by famine, they'll be killed or be raped by, rebel groups or be shot dead. So speak to us, provide us with, the intimate portrait of what it means to be a woman in Sudan as we speak now, almost 1.5 years since this conflict erupted and counting.
Yeah, so it's, being a woman, it intersects, with what's been said by Reem and Abubakr, and I'd really like to, to speak about, indigenous mechanisms, and because women are leading, and they are making critical decisions, life and death decisions about communities, about their families, about elders and children. So while, consistently being victimized, of course, by these brutal atrocities, they are at the same time the one who are acting and making critical decisions, and standing up in front of the face of these, horrific situations. And I think, what we have done as Sudanese, standing with our people was exceptional. I think we have, all, poured our heart, our resources, everything we have, to support our communities and network. We are a collective, communities. We live with each other. We support each other as families, as neighborhoods, as, communities and so on. But I think what's really unfair, is the fact that we were left alone in this process, completely and utterly left alone. And that's very, very painful, For me, it's extremely painful to see, young men and women at the front line, confronted with this brutality, getting killed on daily basis, young women being sexually assaulted, and they are service providers. They are at the front line, and those things happens, and it happens in every day, on daily basis, whether in hospitals, in in community centers, and being the target of this brutality, or being profiled, and detained, by both belligerents. That's very dangerous. And to see, that the international community is abdicating its responsibility towards Sudan in terms of providing trainings, in terms of providing capacity, in terms of extending support to those young people, to be able to do what they were supposed to do. I have, first respondents who would tell me, and they were active on the medical field, and they will tell me, or the health field, we don't know what to do to a survivor of sexual violence that comes to us, and we try to support her, give her the protocols, but we have no resources, for example, to help her to leave the area. Because most of the women who gets raped, they get raped over and again, and they say ourselves are subjected to ongoing assault, and ongoing violence, and so that's a real issue. So I am very cautious and always concerned about exaggerating, the role and the influence, that the young people could play on the ground under the current circumstances. I 100% believe that local structure is much needed to be functioning, but against this brutality, it doesn't make sense. It's literally suicidal, and we have to be very, very honest, that there is a need for protection of frontline workers. There is a need for resources, so that they can protect themselves and they can navigate this brutal context, and there is a need for a strategy, for humanitarian aid that does not necessarily, sacrifice, Sudanese youth by putting them at the front line and just, assuming that they are doing great work, but they are losing, many of them are losing their lives. Thank you.
Reem, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I want to first, before I build on Hala's, comment and also give further recommendations, I want to say that I was not surprised by the very widespread sexual violence that happened during the war. And it's not only because war, rape is a weapon of war, but because Sudan's history, there was always a lot of impunity when it comes to sexual violence, especially against women. Decades of women being subjected to that, and there was no justice at all. I mean, the only case that I followed that, at the end of the day, the perpetrators were taken to prison were because they had raped a foreign peacekeeper, But when it comes to Sudanese women and girls, you go to court, you try to get justice, and then you're swayed from doing that. Or the judge tries to persuade the family or manipulate them into marrying their, daughter to to her rapist. So the whole system kind of colludes, whether it's the judiciary system, the society, everyone colludes against, the survivor, forcing her to do a lot of things. So in a way, when it comes to the military, they always got away with it, So I was not very surprised, that this happened. And I also want to say something. There was, after the revolution, after 2019, I think because women were very much leading the protest movement and on the front lines, there was a huge backlash And we kept saying there's a huge backlash against women after 2019. We saw a huge increase when it comes to honor killings. We saw a lot of sexual violence against women protesters. So and also a lot of the narrative itself became against women. So the narrative that because of you, the country is getting destroyed. And right now we're blamed for the war. You know, you asked for too much freedom, you know, you dressed this way, you talk this way, you did this, you did that. So right now we are blamed for the war. So when you have a narrative that is kind of based on blaming women for the destruction of the country, then obviously, you know, this kind of violence against them in a way is sanctioned, almost sanctioned, right? What I'm worried about right now is, of course, there's so many also women that we don't even know what's happening to them, kidnapped women, women who have disappeared and so on. So a lot needs to be done in terms of psychosocial support, legal reform, making sure that they're protected. But I'm also thinking about, are they going to be included in the cost of war? Right now, when people think about, you know, the destruction, they think about the infrastructure. But do they think about the cost of war in terms of the women, the survivors of sexual violence? Because I know one case, and after she was, you know, freed 2 months later, after she was kidnapped by the RSF and then she was freed 2 months later, she's not speaking right now. She has completely gone mute. So I'm thinking about the cost of war to them, rehabilitating them, reintegrating them into the community, providing them with options, providing them with psychosocial support. This needs to be budgeted for. This needs to be acknowledged. This needs to be recognized as we need to give them a chance to reach their potential that they will probably not be able to because of what happened to them, because of this deep trauma. So yeah, so I feel that right now we need to have the right conversations, but right now we need, you know, protection. We need we need, when the international community talks about humanitarian aid, when they talk about ceasefire, they also need to talk about, where are the women? Release the women who have been kidnapped, bring them back. The women who have been sold into sexual slavery, forced into prostitution, they need to be freed. They need to return back to their families. This is also a demand that I never really see, you know, very much. Thank you.
Abubakar, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but Sudan's conflict, this latest round of conflict, it has seen many actors, state and non-state, taking a very prominent role, not least the UAE, which is, you know, there is enough publicly available information to show that they are supporting the RSF. How can this be addressed where, you know, an external actor is an active player in fanning the flames of war? What accountability mechanisms, what should the international community, the regional countries in the region do to address these and prevent the situation from getting worse?
A very juicy question. And I'll try to answer my best. And I think my answer is not going to talk about what I think the international community and the foreign actors should do. My answer would be more to maybe describe the environment that allowed the situation to happen. And I'll try to iterate and build on the other panelists as well. Before the war and since the independence, and maybe before that, if we track the story of the Sudanese communities since the colonization era, there was a shift that took place from, let's say, agricultural production towards subsistence farming, towards production for exports. This trend was triggered in the early 1900s, and it continued to develop and flourish all through the post-independence era. And I think a byproduct of that is our markets in Sudan kept deteriorating. And I placed a huge emphasis on the deterioration and the dysfunctionality of the markets in Sudan, because they're supposed to be the main generators of livelihoods. And if we take a snapshot of the situation currently in Sudan, the main generator of the livelihoods is war. So when we speak about the outcomes of the war and the things that we don't like to see, I perceive this information as on the note of rights. These are the rights that we want to enjoy in our country. But with the list of rights, there should be a list of responsibilities. What are the responsibilities that we need to take care of to guarantee these rights? And I see the war and the famine, I see them as byproducts of dysfunctional markets and lack of income generating opportunities. That's one lens. A second lens is out of this entirety of situation, and before the war, we had 10 to 15% of the economy, only that was formal. Maybe 80 to 85% was informal economy. The state had zero control over it. Central Bank of Sudan says every 100 SDGs I print, I can monitor 9 SDGs in the formal banks. So I would say before the war, Sudan was a very ripe place for black markets, for informal sector, and this extends through the state institutions where we see the army and we see the informal army, the RSF. We also see the agriculture, the mining, the manufacturing sector. We also see the counterpart that is informal, militia-like. And when we address the informal sector, it's not just the UAE who's involved. A lot of countries are involved. When we look at the gum Arabic, the entire world is benefiting from the Sudanese gum Arabic that is completely smuggled, and it's okay, but it's not okay to smuggle weapons. That's where we draw the line, I see. And I want to make this link very clear. When we smuggle crops, gum Arabic, for example, what we get 20 years later is smuggling of weapons for war. So this is just my take on the question, and I would like my colleagues maybe to iterate or answer some more. Thank you.
Hala, this is your question too.
No, absolutely. I mean, I can't agree more with Abubakr. Militarizations and recruitment of young people, that has been going on for decades. But also, I think the failure of Sudan is the failure of the region and the politics around Sudan. The fact that Sudan is very vulnerable and very volatile country, it's also largely impacted by what's happening around it. And I think for example, the war in Yemen, which has led to massive recruitments and mobilizations of rural youth from across the country, and the Sudanese regime at the time, the leader of the RSF, they really actively participated in that, and of course, this is combined with the collapsed education system. I mean, I think being poor and very poor should not necessarily, and corrupt country to a large extent, lead to this where we are. I think there is triggering factors, that contributed to this. Absolutely. The level of corruptions, the illicit, political economies, and all this, that has been happening. That's very, very true. But I think also there is the new patterns of geopolitics that was introduced, to the region by certain countries like the UAE rising, and growing ambitions, in terms of having control and capacity to dictate, the certain countries within the region. And I think this is not, I think this is primarily the mistake of the Sudanese political elites, absolutely, being military or civilians, and they have been critical mistakes that was made that led to this situation. Reem spoke clearly about issues of justice and accountability. 2019 revolution has provided an excellent opportunity for Sudan to get on its feet. But I think, we really encounter serious crisis of leadership, at both level, the executive and the military level. But also the other issue, that contributed to that, the fact that, the deep crisis in Sudan, a country that has been in conflict since 2003, whether in Darfur or in South Kordofan, with pockets of armies, small armies, and pocket of war across the countries, and how lightly the transition has been taken, to the point that, decisions like, canceling or seizing the UNIMED, the United Nations African Union mission, from a very, very tense and polarized region like Darfur, has been one of the most critical mistakes, which is it took away any kind of observatory mechanisms, into the level of militarizations, into the, flow of arms into the country, and what's happening inside, and that has happened, by the international actors, in collaboration with the Sudan transitional government. The lack of interest in pursuing justice, as Reem said, Bashir, the first thing that every Sudanese wanted is for Bashir to be handed in to the International Criminal Court, and for the crimes they committed in Darfur and the people around him. But the justice issue was never been, central for the transitional government. Contrary, they really wanted to reconcile, with the military, and just make sure that they don't antagonize or trigger. And that's an approach, but considering, how volatile the situation is in Sudan, I always felt that the civilian body could have capitalized on the legitimacy, that was given to them by the Sudanese people, rather than, identifying more with the military actors. In my view, this is what has happened, and so it's a sequence of mistakes that has led to that. But just back to your questions, it's, unfortunately, the fact that Sudanese themselves are not talking to each other, is really obstructing any political process and allowing external actors, to play a bigger role than it should be. And that's in itself is the problem.
Yeah, I have a question from the guest, and Reem, this is directed at you. Can you discuss the role the US plays? Because US allies, Egypt and UAE, both are playing certain role in this conflict. So do you think, US is playing a positive role? They have a special envoy who has been very public about what he is doing. But the United States also has its allies, UAE and Egypt, playing different roles. You can add, Saudi Arabia to that list as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think that the US, for some time now, it has outsourced its foreign policy in a way to its allies, especially in the Gulf countries. So they have a lot of power on what the US does, and they also have a lot of impact on and influence on the way it deals with the situation. So I think for a very long time, the US was engaged, of course, from the second month of the conflict through the Jeddah, peace talks with Saudi Arabia, but it has left a lot of the work to, Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. And if I may say, the UAE was never challenged. I mean, yes, there are different, senators and Congress members and so on who are coming forward and saying that the US should hold the UAE accountable for its role in the war of Sudan, because they continue to fuel the conflict through arming basically the RSF to its teeth. But the US has a lot of interests, with the UAE. So it's unable to kind of really hold the UAE accountable, or in a way maneuver a little bit to make sure that the UAE stops supporting the RSF. And it's not only the US, it's also the UK. The UK has been protecting the UAE, right, at the Security Council. So there are a lot of interest, and unfortunately Sudan is just really not considered, that much of a significant, I would say, geopolitical power for them to make sacrifices in a way. So the UAE, the US, its role has been okay, but like I said, because the way it has built its foreign policy and the way it intervenes in the last few years, it's not very influential. The envoy has been working for a few months now. The problem is also, I feel that there's a lot of misinformation that is happening. I mean, one of the things I find it very funny that he continues to post about how he's meeting the Sudanese civil society. When I look at the pictures, I just realize they are members of organizations that are basically part of Taqaddum. So he's meeting the same people, the same coalition over and over again. Because of course every time he's been told, oh, they represent this, body, they represent this body. A lot of misinformation. One of the things, for example, that was taken into consideration during the Geneva, peace talks by the US and the envoy is this survey that was done. And when you look at the people behind it, you automatically see names that are affiliated with the RSF. So I don't know if this is, that they're really misinformed, or that they are doing this on purpose, or that they really just don't know the context and they don't have enough advisors to give them the right information. I'm unable to tell, but I feel that when you don't really know the actors involved, and you don't really understand sometimes the context, and you don't understand the deep divisions that the country is going through, and the polarization, and the fact that, Hala said we're not talking to each other. It's true. The civil society has been completely torn apart, because of, loyalties to different, agencies, because there's a lot of political money involved, So I think all of this really needs to be taken into consideration. The UAE, just to, sum up, the UAE is a colonial force right now. I see it as a colonial force that wants to take over territory, that wants to replicate the DRC scenario. And why I say the DRC scenario, where you have a country that is rich, and the local population is basically enslaved, so they could work on the mines and they could extract the resources for the colonial forces. This is really what they see in Sudan, that this population needs to be subjugated. And the only way for the Sudanese people, who are very proud, very strong, very, resistance oriented, to be subjugated, they need to be broken, by this war. So they need to be broken, so then you could enslave them and they could work on the farmlands and in the mines to extract the resources and farm, and of course, to the benefit of the UAE and its allies.
To either Umar or, Abubakar or Hala, what is the role of the African Union, or what should the role of African Union be? This is a cycle we're going through. 20 years ago, you saw Mbeki and the team. We saw the deployment of peacekeeping mission. What is the role currently of the African Union, or what should the African Union's role be in this conflict in order to find a diplomatic and political solution to this crisis?
I think
want to go
Hala
first?
should go for this. You
Right.
take it.
Thank you. I always say one thing, you know, and I keep saying it, that Sudan is too large to fall apart alone. So if Sudan is going to fall apart, and it is falling apart, it's going to take with him, you know, many countries around it. And we see that already. You know, we see the signs of collapse, and which is, for me, it's quite surprising, you know, that the African Union is not assuming a very serious leadership and agency on this matter. The current situation in Sudan is impacting all the countries around Sudan. You know, recruitments and militarization is extending across the Sahel region. Those actors who are, coming to Sudan, they are coming from all over. Many are Sudanese, but we have thousands of, professional soldiers who were recruited from the Sahel and from, parts of the Horn, and some of our neighbors. And that's a fact, So and we understand very well, how militarizations will jeopardize the security, in those countries. We understand really well, that the issues of borders, it's becoming a hub for smuggling, for trafficking, and that, there is factions of militia and armies who are actually crossing borders in and out. And so there is, and the countries around Sudan, they are all struggling with pockets of conflicts, and they are volatile, many are overpopulated. So it's quite surprising, that the African Union does not prioritize, and take the issue, this crisis, much more seriously. And I think, there have been definitely a crisis of leadership within the African Union, and they have been really, a crisis of, of capacity to engage, in complex situation. But I think particularly the case of Sudan, it should have drawn, much more interventions from the AU. Right now, unfortunately, we don't see much. The High Panel has a very peripheral role. They are trying to push through as much as they can. But I think they are, lacking tools, and I don't think the efforts equate, the size of the crisis, which is extremely unfortunate for the AU. Yeah.
One other question is the question of accountability. The weapon industry, there's a lot of weapons that are coming into the region, fairly porous borders. You have transhumance groups that cross the border from Sahel to the Horn of Africa. Because of this level of militarization, should the producers of these weapons also be held accountable when their weapons are, used to commit egregious human rights violations and the disregard for human life and the humanitarian law, international humanitarian law? Abubakar, it's quite a kind of question that you would want to answer, I'm sure.
Yes, but I'm not sure you think this is an answer. It will probably look like a deflection.
Don't send it to Hala. Don't send it to Hala. I have another question for Hala.
I'll say a few words and then pass it to Reem, actually.
Yeah.
I think I'll circle back to my original point, which was I'm generally not pro holding people accountable for atrocities, more than let's stop the atrocity first and then see what are the possibilities. And with regards to stopping the atrocities currently, I think it's really difficult, but one of the shortest routes is to provide the alternative. I remember Reem a few minutes ago, she was saying the diplomacy of the US is outsourcing its responsibility to the Gulf. We also spoke about the African Union and the roles it can play. But I honestly see the major gap is from our side, the Sudanese people. What is the resolution, the vision, the dream, the solution we're putting into the table? And I understand that a lot of weapons are coming in, but I would be really interested to provide an alternative view of what other products can come into the country to fight the smuggling of weapons, for example. I'll just keep circling back to currently war is the driver of the economy, it's the driver of thinking, it's the driver of everything. And we need to compete with the war. It's media machine, it's economic machine, it's symbolism, it's morality. And maybe after that we can go to secure the accountabilities and rights. But I'll pass it to Reem. Reem, go on.
Before I answer, I also want to just say two things, just to comment on what Hala said. I think the AU generally, the way it works, it tries to kind of delegate to the regional bodies, right? So the IGAD, in this case, the IGAD in Sudan, it's seen as biased, to the RSF. I think let's just put things straight. It's seen as biased because it's the leaders in the region, so Hemeti did his PR tour and they all met him, as if he's, the president basically of Sudan. So I think there's a lot of concern that, this has led to accusations of being biased to Hemeti or of having, or of also the other thing is, and it's quite sad that the UAE has been doing a lot of, investments and has been doing a lot of diplomatic, marathons in East Africa and in the Horn of Africa. And in many cases, it is related to the situation in Sudan. So this is just to comment on the role of the AU. And to also move to, the issue of, and this is also to answer Kelsey's question. Hala said a keyword, the Sahel. The Sahel, Sudan's problem is connected to the Sahel because the RSF is made up mostly 90%, if not more, of nomadic, tribes that are spread out across the Sahel. What they have in common is that they're impoverished. They are herders, in places where there's water problems, especially not in Sudan, but generally in Darfur and beyond. And they are disenfranchised in the different countries where they live, and they are looking for a place to settle. So let's just put it in a way that some of them have dreams of finding a homeland, And if we assume that, they view that Sudan is an appropriate homeland for them based on prophecies and a lot of folk tales and so on about being near the Nile and having access to water and so on, because there is generational thirst, in this group, then this is why it's an incentive, because we're talking about groups that have been facing discrimination in different parts. Let's not forget that this nomadic group has been kicked out of Niger twice in the past 50 years, for example, and they are facing problems in Chad and so on. So for them, the incentive is that they will finally fight and it will be tough, but they will settle, and their families and children and so on will benefit from having access to this new country. This is why in Khartoum, our houses were taken over, families moved into our homes. In Khartoum, in Jazeera, in Niala, in so many cities across Sudan, we were forced out and the buses came bringing people in. So I think this is something that should be taken into consideration. When it comes to the militarization and weapons, let's also note that the Darfur conflict, that really flared up in the 1980s because of the Libya-Chad war. So definitely the conflict in neighboring countries impacted, and caused huge weapons proliferation. And since then, Darfur has struggled with just widespread weapons proliferation due to the conflict, in Chad, and then of course in Libya and in Central African Republic, because it borders a number of countries that all have problems. So I think having just right now what's happening in Sudan, a lot of arms coming in because all the countries around us in a way are, unstable, and they have conflicts, and weapons are just basically so common. Even in Sudan, a lot of people actually bought weapons from the RSF themselves. The soldiers who just kind of gave up, or they looted, they finished looting and they want to get out. So they sold their weapons to people and if you just, they're sold it for such cheap prices. And this really made me remember a quote by Julie Flint in the book on Darfur. She said that at some point, the price of the Kalashnikov weapon was cheaper in Darfur than in Russia, where it's made. So this is how much it was so common that it was so cheap. I think definitely, I think the pressure should not be on the manufacturers, because at the end of the day, this is a huge industry that is so powerful, right? The military industrial complex. But I think definitely on the countries, that basically supports the manufacturers, or that are housing the manufacturers themselves, they should be basically put under a lot of scrutiny. And I think there are a lot of avenues to look at. The Small Arms Treaty is one of them. The Arms Treaty is one of them. Different kind of mechanisms that we just don't even use to advocate, for against this weapons proliferation, and against this militarization that is also forced on us, because it's very profitable to sell weapons, in Africa and in Sudan and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've got two more questions and then we'll open up as we go along. One is to either of you, what does a credible infrastructure of aid localization and delivery looks like? It's my contention that if localization were to work, Sudan is a perfect place. If it doesn't work in Sudan, where since the outbreak of conflict, mid-April in 2023 to date, the people who have been delivering humanitarian aid at a massive cost in a very difficult, perilous situation are the Sudanese, emergency rooms. So what would be, I like what Reem, you said about, all these products of revolutionary fervor that was built, 2018, 2019. So what does that infrastructure looks like? Because right now, access is a big problem across the border and within the border, across the line, areas that are controlled by RSF versus the areas that are controlled by the SAF. So can you imagine what would that look like in order for it to be able to continue delivering on scale? That is taking into account what you said, Hala, that look, let's not take our young men and women to the front line of this incineration machine that is eating up Sudanese every single day.
So maybe I can go first. I think localization is not a magic wand. It doesn't work on its own. It requires, especially in a status of war, it requires protection. Every aid operations requires protection, and without protection strategy that is in place, it's really difficult to speak about a systemic ongoing functioning strategy. And I think it's really very, very important. We have to be honest with ourselves, and to I think with the young people, with the communities, young and old people who are doing in Sudan is amazing. It's heroic. Literally, they are heroes. Just against impossible situations. But in my view, that will not resolve, the challenge. It will not end the famine. I see how they keep, leaving, or they get killed. I see community kitchens being looted, and they keep trying, coming back together, within these 4 or 5 kilometers. But the scale of the crisis is massive. It's huge. Sudan has 45 million people. Those who fled, out of their villages and home, are about 12 million to 13 million people maximum. Those who managed to flee into other countries are about 6 million people or so on. The numbers, of course, are rising because the situation becomes unbearable. I have family members, I have friends who are living in RSF areas, and some of them who moved into SAF territories in IDPs shelters. And I know that it's such an impossible situation to endure. In RSF areas, it's getting worse by the minute. And unless you were really forced to be there, it's very difficult because it's cities and villages under siege. They were looted to the bone. There is nothing, and even, the efforts of, that was made by community kitchens, by the emergency rooms is the target, and themselves, they are leaving. So if we don't have a realistic strategy, of protections and a realistic strategy to disperse aid into Sudan, it's going to be really difficult to sustain this situation. There is millions of people that are still inside. They will continue to be hungry. The situation is deteriorating by the minute. Just final word, localization is not a magic word. It doesn't happen overnight. It requires protections, it requires clear strategy, and it requires, a very clear, actionable consequences in case the protection code being violated. And so far, we don't have that. We don't even have IDPs camps, which is basic humanitarian law requirement. In Sudan, until now, we don't have displaced camps. Our people who fled their homes, they live in community centers, they live in schools, they live on the streets. So it's beyond miserable. And as I say, before, Sudan is the clear case where you would see that, the international community is abdicating and abandoning their humanitarian and human rights responsibility. Yeah.
Reem, you want to come in, or you?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, my internet, I lost you for a second. I think I'm just thinking about a few things when it comes to localization. The first thing is speaking to the community, making sure that we also understand their needs. And I feel that this is definitely something, because I am talking to people who are receiving, like, food aid, for example, and I think there are just assumptions that are being made on, like, the needs of Sudanese people, what they eat, what they like, what they consume. If there's some parts in Sudan, if you give them rice, for them rice is dessert, rice with milk, but it's not a meal. So just simple things that kind of people, when they receive the food aid, I think it's also this assumption that when you're a refugee, when you're in a war-torn area, you're supposed to just be thankful for anything you get, right? But it's also about what do people need? Because there are two things. One, sometimes they're not getting the things that they actually consume, and this is an issue. Two, when they get things that they don't need, what happens is they go to the market and they sell some of the food aid. You know, a lot of people are selling it. So the food aid that we're seeing in the market is not necessarily because of corruption, but it's also because of people selling what they don't need or what they don't understand, what they do not, you know, consume, and so on. So having this kind of communication on the needs of the communities that are displaced is very important. Supporting the local responders, protecting them, because we see them being subjected to violence. We see them being attacked because of the shrinking civic space. We also have to talk about the meaning of famine, because famine right now in Sudan is a very problematic word. It's a word that you cannot mention because you're automatically, you know, you get accused of trying to basically, you know, lie or manipulate. Because I think people don't understand that famine is not about not having food, because a lot, you know, people have food, a lot of them, but it's about access. It's about you cannot afford to buy food, a lot of things, you know. So I think also like deconstructing this word, because if people, the communities themselves see this word as being problematic and see you as saying a word that is so harmful to them, then you have a problem. See, then we do have a very serious problem. I'm also thinking of like kind of long-term strategies. You know, people need, they need hubs, they need to have access to internet. Internet is a very big problem right now in Sudan. And for young people, it's really a lifeline, you know, to continue studying. And when they stay in school and they start developing new skills, they are less likely to become militarized. And this is what we want, less people militarized. Other things such as what Hala said, you know, camps. I think having camps, because we also, the problem right now, a lot of people, IDPs, are staying with their families and so on. So we cannot really understand the number of people who have needs and who really need protection and who need access to food aid and so on. Very difficult to do this work when you cannot bring them together. And also just making sure that they have humane, you know, conditions, you know, not staying in schools and so on, where a lot of people died, including this famous, you know, comedian and actress. She died in a school, basically, where she was stuck for a few months. So making sure that they're staying in conditions that are dignified, you know, because they deserve this. You know, they have been out, you know, forced out of their homes. They want to have dignity. Last but not least, also, how do you integrate the IDPs into the local community? A lot of the safe states right now have a lot of land, agricultural land, that is not really part of the agricultural projects, or it's not really farmed. How do you make sure that the IDPs are given resources, and then you agree with the local landowners or the states to make sure that they farm the lands that are not farmed, so they benefit, the community benefits, the host community is able to accept them, and they're also able to feel that they're contributing, they're doing something. They're not just sitting and receiving, you know, aid and not really contributing and doing something with their life. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. While we are here, I just want to give a shout out to some of the Sudanese-led charities. That is Sudanese American Physician Association, Greater Chicago Sudanese American Association, Darfur Women Action, Feel a Heart, you know, Sadakat USA, Home, Sudanese Solidarity Collective, Khartoum Aid Kitchen, and other international organizations like Save the Children, International Committee of the Red Cross, Islamic Relief Sudan, Doctors Without Borders, Helping Hand USA, and International Rescue Committee Sudan. I mean, for people who are in the spirit of giving, you know, give generously. We are almost coming to an end, but I just want you to take a couple of minutes to speak about, you know, the media neglect of the Sudanese conflict. It's not just the diplomatic, you know, neglect that we see. You know, 20 years ago, everybody knew about Save Darfur movement, and that movement generated a lot of attention. We can have some discussions on the margins of if it was all good or not. But right now, you know, for a conflict that has gone for this long, that it is breaking all the numbers and records, the number of people displaced, number of people in need, over half, of Sudanese are in the doors of famine. That's 26.5 million. Over 10 million people have been displaced, some internally, and 6 million across. But it doesn't get a lot of attention. So why, if 20 years ago things were slightly different, now it is not, even by the standard of African crises?
I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think the bandwidth of the international community is just becoming, smaller and smaller. So right now, I think the conflict in Gaza and Ukraine war, it's just taking a lot of the bandwidth and a lot of the focus, simply because they're just more strategic than Sudan. So a lot of attention and media attention is going to that, and a lot of resources, because with attention you need resources, you need to send journalists to cover, you need to do that, and they're doing that with the other conflicts. But with Sudan, we're seeing less journalists going there. Of course, there are also restrictions. I'm not saying that there are no restrictions when it comes to visas, travel, also safety, ability to move around the country. You need a lot of different layers of permits. So definitely, it's not a priority. Sudan is not a priority. The Sudanese people, because they're divided, because there's a lot of polarization, we're unable to really get our voices across just the way we did in 2019 during the revolution, because we were united around the cause. So we were able to communicate with the international community, and we were able to, organize in different places, whether it's protests around the world or speaking to the media and so on. Right now, with all the divisions and frustration and anger and grievances, we're unable to come together and have kind of a coordinated approach, to dealing with the media and so on. There's also a fear climate. I think people are scared to go to the media, to go on different stations, to talk, to share their perspective. Very few people talk, or the ones who are able to speak are the ones who live in mostly, in places where they have passports or they have a legal status that allows them to do this. I think also, our situation being very precarious, as refugees and so on, it's difficult for us to kind of make choices like that, because it could affect our security, especially when you're in countries where you're not really allowed to speak. So I think mainly, bandwidth of the international community, focus on other conflicts. Access to Sudan is an issue, and civic space in Sudan is a problem. The climate of fear and the precarious situation of people who are able to speak out is an issue. So it's a number, definitely, of issues that is contributing to that.
But I think even while we're saying that, I think we need to give credit to the local Sudanese journalists, especially those who are covering in Arabic language. And there's not many people who speak Arabic, but they are doing the dogged work of trying to get as much information, and news, Radio Debaga, and others are doing a wonderful job. Hala, I think this is something that you have to mention. Abubakr, you can't run away from this, even if you are in Rwanda.
The media question. We're still on that. I think it's fatigue. It's a chronic crisis. Sudan is always on the news. Something is breaking, something is wrong. All through the decades. I also see it that we don't have many friends, in the neighboring countries, in the region. We are that neighbor who's hostile, who's rude to their neighbors, who has a lot of issues in the neighborhood. I honestly see it from that lens. If we look at the past 30 years, 35 years under the Islamist rule in Sudan, we haven't been the best member in the community. And before that, we haven't been the best member in the community. So I see it as an issue of friendship. We don't have a lot of friends, and people are fatigued by the chronic crisis. I think one last sentence would be, we are yet to develop and share a solution, a resolution, a dream. Thank you.
Hala, we give you the honor of rounding it off before we hand it over to Lara to close it out for all of us.
I don't think a lot of people, they understand what's actually happening in Sudan. And I think the world likes simple stories, good and bad. And it's such a complex situations, that has heavy geopolitics around it. All Sudan represent a shift in the regional politics. And I think the global politics starts with the war in Ukraine. And now we are seeing a shift in the Middle East, Horn of Africa, and the Sahel region in terms of how, countries engage with each other. That, it's also, it's a difficult case, as Reem said, it's also a shocking case. 5 years ago, Sudan was a story of optimism and hope, and severe counter-revolutions. Situation has happened that it actually led to this campaign of atrocities, but it was always there, hidden. And I also think that, as Sudanese, we don't know, we're learning how to speak about what we are enduring and what's happening to us. And I find that quite interesting, actually, that, many Sudanese, and Abubakr, you have to excuse me, but I would say all, particularly Sudanese men, they really, and I'm speaking also, you would understand, Abdullahi, about the men in my family, friends, how they can talk about, the pain inflicted on them, the horrific situation. It's really difficult for them to convey that. There is always this keenness of showing up that we are together, we're not broken, we're not, and that has, it gives often, the wrong idea, because the level of devastation, what's happening in Sudan, is beyond anyone's imagination. And I think we should learn how to talk about it and be brave on saying it as it is. I think that's really critical, so that, we get the attention we deserve. Yeah. And this is part of the solution, is to be able, to speak up about what's happening to us. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank Reem, thank Abubakr, thank Hala as always. And thank you, Lara, for hosting us. It's been a pleasure, and this is one of the many. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's not easy when you are talking about your country, that especially when it's at war, when your family members are involved, and especially when, as Abubakr said, there's a fatigue setting in, but you can't afford, somebody who is from the country to switch off. It consumes you. It's personal, it's professional, it's everything. I hope next time when we are meeting to have this conversation, it's not about, how many people have been killed, but how to rebuild Sudan, how to rebuild Khartoum. How can Sudan be what the dreams and aspirations that many have? I just want to say, I'm Kenyan. I remember growing up as a child, many people from my small town going to study in Sudan. Some of the doctors in my town, people who are trained in Sudan. Some of the, religious leaders in my town, in my neighbors actually, went to school in Sudan. I want one day, hopefully, we'll join in a happy circumstance than this. Over to you, Laura.
Well, it's hard to follow up that, Abdullahi, so I'd almost like to leave it there, but I want to join Abdullahi in thanking our panelists, and really approaching this with so much gratitude for the wisdom that you've shared with us, but also the way that you've really brought that to the human level. And we know and recognize as your audience that you have family members and friends who are experiencing this as you are as well in the midst of displacement. And so our thoughts are so much with you. I was really taken, Hala, by just the way you phrased it earlier. We were left alone in this process, and you know, the emanating goal from this, not just today, but this whole year-long series, is keep eyes on Sudan, because several of us here at Georgetown in various centers and programs would like the Sudanese people, you all here, but others, to know that we don't want you to feel alone, and we'd like to learn from you and continue to do things. So thank you so much for your time today to point out to us what you and your families and colleagues have been going through, what more we can do. I certainly join Abdullahi in looking forward to a time in the future when we'll be meeting under different circumstances as well. Reminding all of you on the call that there are organizations that will be posted on our website that you can donate to both financially and with your time and energy as well, and that we will have further events in the coming months to keep eyes on Sudan, because certainly Sudan is very much in our thoughts. So thank you all. Stay safe and well today and in the future, and may we meet again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.